What are the commonalities among leaders who sustain excellence over an extended period of time?
All right, Morgan, I feel like I know you because I've read so many of your essays for years. And so I know you through hearing your voice in my mind, but this is the first time we got to talk. So I just want to say thank you for all the great writing you put out, and welcome to the Learning Leader Show.
Well, thank you for having me, Ryan. I'm happy to be here. And I'm curious if my actual voice matches the voice that was in your head, because it usually doesn't when you have these
The
things.
voice that was in my head was my voice. So no, it would never
That's
match.
interesting. I mean, we don't have to spend too much time on this, but whenever I'm reading other people, I usually have somebody else's voice.
That's a good point.
Narrating it. It's like the Morgan Freeman thing, but it's never Morgan Freeman, but it's always someone else narrating it for me.
You know, that's actually a good point where you think of, I didn't actually even see, I didn't look at a picture of you for years. So I literally only saw the written text. I didn't look at your about page. I would just look at your essays and just read them and reread them. And one of them really caught my eye. And maybe we could even start here, even though I plan to go here later. But you wrote about two of your friends. And this particularly hit me because I love Lake Tahoe. I've skied there in the water and on the mountains. And I want to tie this story into writing as a whole as well, because I think writing is the greatest networking tool in the world. And I would imagine you probably either agree or that aligns with the way that you think.
Totally.
So first, I want to get to that story in a second about your two friends in Lake Tahoe, but can you share overall your mindset towards why you write so much and what it has brought to you personally as well as your business?
Well, let me give you two answers. I'll give you the practical answer and then the deeper, more thoughtful answer. The practical answer is it's what I do for a living. This is what I do. My 100% of my job is to write. I work for a venture capital firm. My role is to write and do nothing else. I write and I speak at conferences, and that's it. And that's all I've done. I haven't done anything else in my whole career. I started writing at the Motley Fool where I used to work as a junior in college, and it's all I've done since. So that's the practical answer. The deeper, the more thoughtful answer is I write because I don't think there's any better way to crystallize vague thoughts in your head than writing. Everyone has these vague feelings, these vague thoughts, vague ideas that are kind of floating around in their heads that they intuitively know, but they've never actually, sat down and put them into words and clarified them into words. And when you force yourself to do that by sitting down to write them, you realize either two things very quickly. One is that you could really clarify what you thought in a way that makes you say, now I understand it better. Now this makes a lot more sense. Or I think more often, when you go to put it down on paper, you look at it and you say, this idea that I've always thought was true, but now that I put it into words, it's ridiculous. Now that I'm forced to put it into words and I'm bypassing gut feelings, if you can't rely on gut feelings and you actually have to put it into words, oftentimes you write it down and you say, maybe I don't really have an argument here. So I just think writing is a great way to clarify what anyone thinks. I've often called it selfish writing, which is the idea that if you have a blog or you're a journalist, you're writing for other people in theory, right? You have an audience and you're trying to get their attention. You're trying to write for them. But there's a selfish writing component, which is that you're writing for yourself to clarify your own thoughts. One way that I would frame this is for myself, and I think most writers I've met, when you start an article, you start writing, even when you start a book, you have no idea where it's going to go. It's not like you have it all mapped out and you just go and type it out and it's done. And that's why a lot of times if you read something, you might think for a lot of different authors, how did they know this? They just sat down and typed this out. How is all that in their head? And the answer is it was not in their head when they started writing it. As they wrote one sentence and then it reminded them of something else. And that led to another sentence. And then I said, oh, now I'm thinking of this other thing. And you write the next sentence, you say, oh, I should go research that a little bit deeper. It all comes out as you write during the process. So I think that process of writing is helpful for everyone, whether you are a professional writer or not.
So I am 100% on board with this. I think you don't fully realize how much you don't know about a topic until you try to intelligently write about it. I wrote a book about management because specifically that jump from individual contributor to first-time manager. And I thought I knew a ton about it. And I think I have some knowledge because I went through it. I made a ton of mistakes. I tried to learn from mentors. I learned from my own mistakes and fixed it. And we ended up doing much better, but it took many years. But the process of a publisher giving me a book advance to say, now you have to basically be an expert, and I'm using air quotes for audio listeners, on that, forced me to do an amazing amount of research to really crystallize, as you would say, what I thought about it. In that process, I learned so much. I think writing is a great tool for learning, even if you're writing trying to teach. Just like teaching is a great tool for learning. When you have to get up and speak at a conference or now virtually, you have to get clear on, what do I want to say? What do I believe? What do I think? In the process of coming up for what you're going to say, so much learning happens.
I think how you just framed it is great, is that writing is not just a way to put out your thoughts and to talk to other people. It's a way to learn. It's how you learn. It's not just communicating, it's learning.
What do you say to someone? I recently published an episode with David Perel. He's the writing guy online. It's all he teaches. It's all he talks about. And I had emails and multiple people in leadership positions saying, that's great. That's just not for me. I don't want to do that. I don't have time for that. I just don't like it. What do you say to that person?
That's fine. I would not, and maybe this is an area where David and I diverge a little bit, although I have a lot of respect for David. It's not for everyone. Nothing's for everyone. But it's for more people than think that it's for them. There's people out there who think, there's no reason for me to write. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of those people for whom I think they could really benefit. But is it for everyone? If you really don't like it and it's a waste, you feel like it's a waste of your time, then no, it's not necessarily for everyone. But I think it's a really important skill in virtually any field. One of the big things that's missing in a lot of traditional educations, particularly in public schools, is public speaking. Mm-hmm. Because it's a kind of thing where it's easy to think, I only need to learn public speaking if I'm going to go out and do a lot of it. And it's like, no, the value of public speaking is learning how to communicate succinctly, learning how to communicate to a diverse audience. It's about self-confidence, self-awareness. Like, there's so many things that come from that no matter the skill that you're in, even if you are just talking to one other person, even if it's just you and I talking, just the two of us, becoming a better public speaker will help you formulate an argument verbally and get it out there succinctly in a way that's important for everybody. And I think writing is the same. It's not just, only writers should write. It's just like a natural human skill that I think everyone should learn to some degree, but not necessarily everyone needs to practice it on a daily or weekly basis.
So I want to get to your story, your essay about the 3 sides of risk. And I would love to also hear about the feedback, but maybe you can share this story and why you chose to write it, because I found it to be deeply personal and moving. And I would imagine you probably got emails saying it made people cry. Mm-hmm. It probably even did that to you, I'm guessing, while you wrote it. And it moved me in a way that rarely happens when I'm just reading an essay on a website. And it's just so beautifully and crisply done. And I get a little bit of writer's envy when I read stuff like that. But can you briefly share the 3 sides of risk and maybe a little bit about Brendan and Brian and how that relates to the person who may be listening to this?
Yeah, so I will. So I grew up in Lake Tahoe, California, and I was a skier. I was on the Squaw Valley ski team for many years. Growing up with a group of friends. This is from, let's call this, our mid and late teenage years is kind of the setting here. So the story took place in 2001 when I and my friends were 17 years old at the time. And so I grew up with a group of about a dozen other ski racers, and we did everything together year round. We trained together, we skied together, we traveled together, we were around each other all the time. Most of us more or less bypassed high school and did an independent study program that let us ski 6 days a week. So this is all we did. And I'll give you a briefer version of the story, but we can dig into any part that you want. But we were skiing one day, myself and two of my very close friends who I had been kind of inseparable with for years before that, skiing in February of 2001. And it had just been a giant blizzard in Squaw Valley, the ski resort that we were at. And we were skiing out of bounds, which you're not supposed to do. It's illegal. You duck under the boundary ropes that say do not cross, and then you ski. And we were skiing down the backside of Squaw Valley, which is out of bounds. It spits you out on this backcountry road where we would hitchhike back to the mountain. I had done it with them. In the article, I guess that I had done it a dozen times before. I thought about it afterwards. I probably done it something like 4 or 5 times before, something like that. So I had done this route before, but not very often, because it's a pain in the ass to hitchhike back once you get to the bottom. So we did it once that morning. And as we were skiing down that morning, the 3 of us, myself and my 2 friends, we triggered a very small avalanche. It was the first one that I had ever been in, despite I was skiing 6 days a week for 12 years before that. So I had a lot of mileage under my belt. It's the first avalanche I had been stuck in, and it was pretty small. I don't think it came above my knees. We didn't think anything of it. We laughed about it. We got to the bottom. We commented about how interesting it was. We laughed about it and shrugged it off. And then we hitchhiked back to the mountain. And when we got to the mountain, my 2 friends said they wanted to do it again, the same run. They wanted to do it again. I didn't want to do it for whatever reason. I don't really know why I didn't want to do it, but I said, hey, how about this? Why don't you guys go do the run again? And rather than hitchhiking back, I will drive around the mountain and pick you up when you get to the bottom. They left, and I immediately got in my truck and went around to pick them up, and they weren't there. And didn't really think much of it, but I'll speed up some of the story. The day went on. We didn't find them. Called the police, missing persons report, got search and rescue involved. Search and rescue was on the mountain by about midnight that evening. And the next day, search and rescue and a team of search dogs found them buried under 6 feet of snow, and they had died in a massive avalanche. And it's interesting. I wrote this article based off of an experience I had at a conference last year. And this was a financial conference, an investing conference, where someone asked me, what has skiing taught me about investing? And I thought, well, that hasn't taught me anything about investing, but I got to tell a story now. So I told that story that I just told you. And the analogy that I used is that there are 3 sides of risk. In any kind of risk, there is, the first side is the odds of getting hit by a risk. The second side is the average consequences of getting hit by that risk. And the third side is the tail consequences, the extreme events, the sides that, the 1 in a million circumstances that's really gonna bludgeon you. And I brought that up because we knew as 17-year-olds that skiing out of bounds was dangerous. We knew it was risky, but we thought that the consequences of our risk meant that we might get our season passes pulled, or our coaches might yell at us. Maybe you'd blow out your ACL, which is almost like a rite of passage as a ski racer. Never once ever did we think that the consequences of the risk that we took would meant that we'd die. Never. But that was it. That was the tail end risk of what we were doing. And tail risks are all that matter. That's true for this story that I told about skiing, but that's also true for investing. It's also true about the economy. I wrote in the article how ridiculous it was that as investors and people thinking about the economy, for the last decade, we spent so much time arguing whether risk in the economy meant that the Federal Reserve set interest rates at 0.5% or 0.6%. That was our definition of risk. And then a virus comes along and 50 million people lose their jobs. Like, that's real risk. The tail risk of what we've experienced in 2020, that's risk. The BS that we were talking about in 2014 about what's the Fed going to do next, that's not risk. That's not what moves the needle in people's lives. What moves the needle across your life, the moments that really matter, where the decisions that you make are so imperative to what you're going to do in life, are the tail event risks. So that was how I equated the two. Of what did I learn about investing from skiing? Well, here's an incident where the tail risk completely changed my life forever and ended their lives in the most tragic way you can imagine. And that always had a big impact on me. I didn't think of it in those terms at the time when I was 17, but looking back, I think that was the answer. I think I've been more aware of tail risks since then certainly I was before that, because I was 17, a 17-year-old boy thinks about the world in a very interesting way. But I think I'm probably more attuned to tail risks than other people are. Although I hesitate to say that, because I mentioned this in the article. My story is not necessarily unique. Most people out there have known someone dear to them who tragically died, or have had a near-death experience in themselves. So I know I don't want to argue that like this is unique to me, but that event just made me so aware of the power of tail risks.
So you've chosen to publish another book. It's called the Psychology of Money: Timeless Lessons on Wealth, Greed, and Happiness. And I'm usually, in this case, I'm really interested in that subtitle, Timeless Lessons on Wealth, Greed, and Happiness. And it's 19 short stories exploring the strange ways people think about money, and teaches you how to make better sense of one of life's most important topics. And I'm curious as to what it was that brought you to want to write about the psychology of money in book form, and put these timeless lessons in combining wealth and greed with happiness. Because a book is something that you have to dedicate years of your life to focus on a specific question or questions to try to answer them to help other people. And this is what you've chosen to do. What is it that made you choose this specific topic, or these lessons, or these short stories to share with the world?
So I started as a full-time financial writer in 2007, which was an interesting time to start because this was the early days of the great financial crisis that hit afterwards. That came in 2008. So to me, that was such a, it was not a front row seat, but it was just a big spotlight because I was covering these events for a living to observe what was going on at the time. And it always just struck me that the lessons that you could take away and the explanations for the financial crisis, for why it happened, you could not find in a financial textbook. You couldn't. Like what happened, or even in any economics textbook, you would not find the answers for why something like 2008 would happen. But you could find them in a psychology textbook, or a history textbook, or a sociology textbook about why people do the things they do around greed and fear, and how people deal with opportunity and scarcity, why people would lever up with subprime mortgage bonds. You can't find that in a finance textbook, but you will find it in a psychology textbook. You will find it in a history textbook all throughout history of people doing things that in hindsight are ridiculous, but they do them over and over and over again with great confidence. So that just made me more, the financial crisis made me more attuned to the psychological side of investing, which was different for me because I, at the time, and most people as they are taught finance, is a math-based field. What are the numbers? What is the data? What are the formulas? What does the spreadsheet tell me I should do? What does the spreadsheet tell me is going to happen next? And you treat it as like perfect fact, like it's physics. Like in physics, you have data and formulas, and the formulas are perfect. They give you perfect, precise answers that tell you exactly what's going to happen next. A physicist can tell you exactly how fast a ball is going to roll down a hill, exactly how much gas you need to send a rocket into space. A really silly example that I think is so fascinating. So NASA sent a probe that passed Pluto. I forget when it passed. But from the time it launched from Earth to the time it passed Pluto was within 1 minute of NASA's estimate. From when the mission began, NASA estimated exactly how long it would take to get to Pluto. The actual time was within 1 minute of their estimate to get from Earth to Pluto. There's so much incredible precision that you can do for something like physics, like astrophysics. And we want to think that finance is the same, that there is firm rules and we can come up with firm conclusions that tell us exactly what's going to happen next. And the financial crisis told me that that's all wrong. It's all wrong. That finance is a psychological field. It's a soft field that has to do with people making crazy decisions and oftentimes wrong decisions that don't make much sense in hindsight, but are governed not by the formulas of finance, but from people's own relationship with greed and fear and scarcity. So that got me into, let's call it behavioral finance. And then it was just this idea, a broader idea too, that a lot of what you could learn about finance that was important in finance, that was worth paying attention to in finance, was also true in other disciplines. Like people's relationship with greed and fear is not something that you can just learn about through the lens of finance. You can learn about that through the lens of military history, through the lens of politics, through the lens of biology, sociology, marriage, divorce, all these other fields that fall under this umbrella of how do people deal with risk and opportunity. You can learn investing lessons from that. So if you put those two together, a lot of what I've done writing online, but also for the book, is just trying to survey history in the world and say, what are some kind of often non-investing stories that I can use that teach me something really important about the softer side of investing? And that's what the book is. It's 19 stories, most of which have nothing to do with finance, but end with a very clear takeaway about how we can think about money, not just investing, but money, which is like personal finance and investing and business decisions, in a more rational way that helps us become more attuned with the softer psychological side of dealing with money. So I say in the book, early on in the book, this is not a book about what to do with your money. This is a book about what happens in your head when you try to do things with money, is what it's trying to get at.
Okay, there's a lot to get to. I recently spoke with a guy named Bill Perkins, and Bill's an interesting guy, a controversial episode, but he did make me think. And I wonder if you guys have similarities or not. So I want to pose this question because you've written about working as a hotel valet and parking the $200,000 Ferrari. And you've also referenced that wealth is what you don't see. Bill Perkins is a guy who says he wants to die with zero, meaning with no money in his account. If he wants to take care of his kids, he wants to do that while he's alive and while they're young enough to use it properly to create experience dividends. Meaning, if you want to climb a mountain, you probably aren't going to be able to do that when you're 68 years old and retired, but you can do that when you're 35. So do it when you're 35. So Bill might say, well, we'll buy the experience, exchange your money for the experience, buy the Ferrari because you'll love how it looks and feels when you're out there, versus, I think, successfully balancing the patience required to build wealth. So how would you juxtapose those two things with these creation of memory dividends versus the power of compounding, as well as wealth building and the psychology behind that?
Well, I would also love to die with $0 in the bank if I knew when I was going to die. If I knew exactly when that moment was come, I could plan perfectly for that. But you don't. You don't know whether you're going to die tomorrow or when you're 106 years old. So if you can, that's the challenge of it. To me, and look, the first thing I would say is everyone is different. So yep. I hesitate to say this is what people should do. That plan might work for Bill. It might work for other people. For me, what I think is true for myself, and also I think it's probably the most universal way to use money to make you happier. Not for everyone, but the most universal is using money to control your time, to have more control, to wake up every morning and say, I can do whatever I want to do today. That to me is the highest dividend that money pays. And look, for a lot of people, you will wake up every morning and say, I want to go to work today. I'm not saying use money to retire and do nothing, to sit at your house. You might say you want to go to work. You might say you want to go hike the Himalayas. It's doing whatever you want to do. It's having things, on your own terms rather than dictated by someone else's demands. I've always used this example of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, when he was a child, his mother placed very tight restrictions on what he did. Even when he was 5 years old, he had a very strict schedule. You wake up, you have to do these chores at this time, and then you have this tutor at this time. And FDR woke up one day and he said, Mom, I'm so sick of the regiment that you put me through. I don't have any freedom. Every minute of my day is controlled by someone else. So his mom said, okay, I agree with that. That's a valid criticism. How about for one day you can do anything you want? Whatever you want to do at any time, it's all you. And his mom wrote in her diary that day, FDR was 5 years old at the time, that day that he could do anything he wanted to do on his own times, he did the exact same thing that he normally does on someone else's schedule. But he felt great about it because it was his decision. He was doing it on his own terms. And I think that is so true for most people, that if you have control over your time, which just means like for most people, you have an adequate amount of savings. That means you can pick a job that might have a shorter commute, or you can retire when you want to, not necessarily early, just whenever you want to. Even just knowing that you can do it, even if you don't, is a way that I think you can use money to actually make yourself happier. Is experiences a better way to make yourself happier than buying stuff, than buying a new car or fancy clothes? For most people, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, totally. But it's usually, to me, it's usually broken out as money can buy you experiences or stuff. And I just think adding a third category of control over your time, giving yourself options, even if you never exercise those options, even if you have money in the bank and you just go through life knowing I could retire. I'm not going to, but I could. Even if you don't do it, waking up in the morning knowing that you could is going to make you feel more control over your life. Like you have more control over your life. And that to me is one of the ways that that's something that you will never get used to, in the sense that if you buy a fancy car or a big house, you'll get used to it really quickly. It might make you happy for a week, and then you get used to it. Waking up every morning and saying, I can do what I want to do, like I'm in control, that is something that you will never get accustomed to. It'll feel great forever.
Do you feel that way?
I do, in the sense that I've been a big saver my whole life. So I have a degree of financial independence. It's always on a spectrum. There's a spectrum of financial independence from, being completely reliant on the kindness of strangers to being a multi-billionaire. There's a big spectrum in between there. But in general, I would say, I feel like I could do what I want to do.
With the work that you do and the writing that you produce and the value you bring to your business, I'm looking from afar. I'm wondering the freedom you feel to be able to plan and design your days, knowing that a lot of the value you bring is in your creative output, the ability to attract people to the work that you produce. I have to believe, since you're a writer, that then draws interest in both you as well as collaborative fun, and that's part of why you do what you do and why they employ you, or you are one of the leaders, I assume. Is that how it's put together by design?
Yeah, I mean, so the value of content within the collaborative fund is, particularly for a private investor.
And you guys launched that 10 years ago, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
10 years. Okay. And you were part of the launching team?
No. So I joined in 2016.
Okay. So go ahead. Sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
The value of what I do with content is, particularly for private investments, where you have to win a deal. If we want to invest in the company, it's not like we can just go on to E-Trade and buy shares of that company. When it's a private market, a private business, you have to win a deal. You have to convince other people that you are the investor who is worth partnering with, or else they might go with someone else. And so if your only value as an investor in the private market is that you can write a check, that's a hard way to set yourself apart, because a lot of people can write checks. There's a lot of money in the investing industry. You have to be able to show that you can do something else other than wire someone else money. So the values that you have, the philosophies that you have, how you think about the world, how you treat other investors, what you think is important to you, and what trends in the economy are important to you. Those are ways that you set yourself apart. And those values, those philosophies, that ability to think, doesn't mean anything unless people know about them. You have to put your thoughts out there to the world so people can understand how you think and what is important to you, what your values are. So by putting out content, and not marketing content, nothing that I write is, here's why collaborative fun is the best and here's why you should partner with us. It's not that whatsoever. It's just things that I hope people will be interested in, that they hopefully will share with other people, that just raises the awareness of the firm in a way that hopefully brings our brand name more top of mind to people when it does come time to make an investment or partner with other investors and whatnot. So you could call it marketing. Like I think at its core, that's what the idea is. But I never want to do anything that looks like marketing. I really want it to be stuff that just people, because no one wakes up in the morning and says, I want to read a marketing piece.
Yeah,
I want to read a commercial.
You tell stories. That's what you do for a living, and you find a way of weaving things together, analogies, using stories that have nothing to do with finance or money, but somehow tying it together. And that's the magical part of it. How frequently does it come up when your team at Collaborative Fund is looking to do a deal and somebody in the room has said, I love the way Morgan thinks. I want to work with your team. I've read his stuff. I like the way he believes. It's obviously that you guys value this way of thinking. You value somebody like that. I want to work with you. Like how frequently does that happen?
I don't know because I'm usually not in the room when that happens, but I don't necessarily want
Why
to
wouldn't
know
they bring
because
you in that room though? Seriously, why would if it were me, I would be, especially if they have any inclination that they may be there partially because they've read your work. Why wouldn't they bring you in the room?
well, there are times when I am, if it's a deal that's really related to something that I'm interested in or have some knowledge about, then it will. But for most of the time, I'm doing my writing. I live in Seattle. Most of the team is in New York and San Francisco. But I also wouldn't. I don't know how often it comes up because I wouldn't want to know. I don't think that's a healthy thing for anyone to know. So, and we also don't measure that kind of thing. We just take it. It's not like I have a monthly quota of people, citing me that we need to meet. It's just kind of more or less a leap of faith that if we put a lot of effort into content and wave our hands in a way that gets people to notice our brand, that's going to pay off over the long run.
Yeah.
So there's really no metrics per se that we follow. But one other thing I'd bring up that ties back to like having control over your time and some level of autonomy. There's a lot of reasons that I really enjoy the collaborative fund, but one of the reasons is just full autonomy in the content that I write. Most places, if you're a journalist, even at Wall Street Journal, New York Times, or I would say especially at those kind of places, the writers don't have a very high degree of autonomy. You get an idea, or an editor gives you an idea, and then you can go out and research it and write it, and then the editors whittle it down, cut this out, add this end. They pass it to another editor who cuts this out and slashes this and burns this. And by the time it's published, it's not, it's a collaborative effort. And look, I read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times every day. I think they put out great content. But to me, as a writer, I think writing is an art. And it's an art in the sense of that what one person thinks is great, another person will think is terrible. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's just how it is. It's like painting or sculpting or music. There's music that some people love and other people think is terrible. Writing is the same. And therefore, I don't want other people saying, oh, Morgan, here's what you should write. And, oh, no, you should take out that paragraph and add this. No. This is mine. You can go get your own blog. This is mine. I'm going to write about what I want to write about. And I'm going to say it how I want to say it. And everyone else get their hands off it. I also love that because since it's just mine, and these pieces from start to finish is just me, I love that I can own the successes and the failures. Because if other people were chipping into these articles, then when an article did really well, I couldn't necessarily say, well, that was me. It was like, well, yeah, the article did well, but maybe that was because the parts that the editors put in, people really liked. Maybe they didn't like and then vice versa. If an article does really poorly, I would be able to say, well, maybe it did poorly because the editors took out all the good parts. Versus now when it's all me, I own the successes and the failures, which is a really good way to learn. Because every piece of feedback that I get on an article, positive or negative, I know that feedback is coming straight to me. It's not coming from anyone else because no one else chipped on this piece. It's just me. And I love that autonomy. I think it's really important. I think that's how you learn. And it's just such a more fun, creative process when you can look. I know for a fact there are things that I write that people look at and say, that's dumb. That doesn't make sense. I don't know why he would say that. I would never write that. But to me, that's like good. That's what's making it art. If it's so bland that everyone agrees with it, it's not really art. I love the art side of writing.
You've studied history. You've studied excellence. You've spent time around a lot of people who have sustained excellence. And I'm curious, Morgan, when you have to think about the commonalities among people who have sustained excellence over an extended period of time, what have you found to be some of the common behaviors and or traits of those people?
There's two answers I'll give you. One might seem pretty obvious, so I'll keep it short. And the other is, I think, less obvious. I'll try to elaborate on that a little bit more. The key for almost all of that, and this is the obvious answer, is just patience. It's just sticking with it. The people who can do the best over time are not necessarily the people who are best at what they do. They're just the people that have the fortitude to stick with something during its down periods. And everything, whether you are an investor or a business person, it doesn't matter what you do, everything worth pursuing has down periods when things are not going well, things are out of favor, things are not working, the winds are blowing in your face. It's just the people who have the fortitude to stick that out that do well over time, because that's how compounding works. Compounding doesn't work over a year or 2 years or 5 years. Compounding works when you've been doing something for 10 or 20 or 30 years. That's when your ability, both your knowledge or just the compounding and financial terms explodes and you get really good at something, is when you're going to stick with it. The less obvious answer I will give you, and this almost seems counter to what I just said, but I don't think it's fully counter, is something a topic that I love that's really important, is the value of quitting well. I use the example of Seinfeld, who in 1999, his show was on top of the world. Maybe it was 1998, on top of the world, biggest TV show of all time, so popular, cultural icon. Jack Welch, who was the CEO of GE, who owned NBC at the time, came in to Seinfeld and said, one more year of the show, and Jerry Seinfeld personally would get $100 million, $5 million per episode, which of course, even today, but at the time was completely unheard of. That was just insane amount of money. And Jerry said, no, I'm done. I'm out. We're done. And people all around the world said, why, your show is so good, you're so popular, your ratings are off the chart, why are you quitting? And he more or less said, no, that's the point. He said, the only way to tell when you've truly reached the peak is to experience the decline. And he said, I just don't want to experience, I don't want to experience decline. I'm done. I'm out. And he elaborated a little bit more when he said, look, the show Seinfeld was really good because he and Larry David could spend all of their time kind of walking around the world and observing, sitting on a park bench in Brooklyn and just observing people and figuring out just the mundane nuances of life that made his comedy skits and the show Seinfeld so good. Just these mundane, the episodes about ordering soup at a soup bar, these just like mundane experiences in life that they were able to turn into funny and enriching content. And he said, as he got more famous, he couldn't do that. He couldn't just go sit on a park bench. He couldn't go to a soup kitchen and watch how he couldn't do that anymore. He was kind of cooped up to his apartment because he was so famous. And because of that, he felt like I don't know if he phrased it as running out of material, but I think that was the gist of what he had. He realized as soon as what made him famous was starting to crumble, not famous, what made him successful was starting to crumble, he said, well, okay, I'm out. I'm done. The other example of this that I love is a guy named Marcel Hirscher, who was, as I mentioned, I grew up ski racing. Marcel Hirscher, and he's not a household name in the United States because ski racing is not big in the United States, but in Europe, he's like the Tiger Woods, the Michael Jordan of ski racing. He's not only the best in the world, but the best of all time, and just kind of in a league of his own. He was just like absolutely incredible. And last year, when he still probably had 5, maybe 7 good years left in him. I think he's 28, something like that. And last year he just announced out of the blue, 2 years ago was his best season ever. And he announced that he's done, he's quitting, he's retiring, never coming back. And everyone's just like, you're so good, why are you quitting? And he almost said the same thing as Seinfeld. He said, the reason I'm quitting is because I feel like I'm at my peak. That's the best time to quit. And he said, look, he felt like he was so lucky that he made it this far in his career without getting injured, which almost every ski racer will. You'll break your leg, you'll blow out your knees. And he said, I made it this far without getting injured. Like, I just want to count my blessings and be done. He just had a kid, his first child. And he said, I just want to go hang out with my kids and I'm done. I had so much respect for that, for people who quit well, versus what happens so often, which is people push it as far as they can. And this is where it gets counter to the first thing I said. They keep going and going and going, and then they're forced to quit as a shell of their former selves. And it's just sad. I guarantee you, and this is obvious. I think this should be obvious. If Seinfeld just kept going and going and going, his show probably would have been canceled in 2006.
Mhm.
Like, you can imagine that alternative history, and it would have been sad. Like the last couple seasons, they would have just been forcing it. And, George and Elaine may have quit and they brought in replacement. It just would have been sad. Instead, when they're on top, they said, this is the time to quit. I actually don't know if that's the best answer to your question of like the mark of excellence among people, but it's a topic that I love. Quitting well is a topic that I love. And I hope that myself as a writer too, whenever I would feel like the young up and coming writers are doing such a better job than me, and I don't get how it works anymore. I don't understand the new social media platforms. As soon as I get to that point, I hope that I can admit to myself what's happening. I can say, okay, I'm done. I'm out. And you'll never hear from me ever again. That's my goal.
So I want to quote some of your work and then try to go through it. So you've said people use success as an indication of what to keep doing, but most success plants the seeds of its own demise. So what people think works and try to copy is always changing. And the reason that I bring up this quote, Morgan, is because my show, and for the past 5 years and moving forward, is about the deconstruction of excellence, to try to distill down the actions, the behaviors, the thought processes, the frameworks of leaders who have sustained excellence over an extended period of time, so that me, as the first learner, as well as the millions around the world, can also take and from those behaviors, those actions, those frameworks, those thought processes, in order to help make them better from a practical application standpoint. I can actually implement this tool or this thought process or this framework in order to make my life better. Given what you've said about success and the fact that, I don't know, we can all create our own definitions of success, and I'm talking more about excellence, and we can compare and contrast there. How can listeners of this show, and me personally, because this is why I started it for my own self, get the most use out of it, other than just entertainment of hearing good stories, to better their lives, if we know that success can sometimes plant the seeds of its own demise?
I think it's just one topic that's related to this that I've always thought strongly about is the idea that in almost any field, there are very few laws. Laws meaning like truths that will always be true. Those laws are very important, very powerful. Most fields, they will explain 90% of what you need to know, but there are very few of them. And everything else other than those handful of laws is subject to change. And you have to be able to have an iron grip on the 3 or 4 laws of your field. And you know that these things are never going to change, and therefore I'm going to devote all my time to these laws. And everything else is, I love the saying, I forget who coined this phrase. I think it's been attributed to many people: strong beliefs weakly held.
Mm-hmm.
That's like everything else that is not an iron law of your field needs to be that. So you can just grab onto what is true, and everything else you can say, look, I believe in this right now, but I am open to this not being true at some point. Because that's the whole history of history, is things changing. And I think most people, it is, I don't know if, I don't think they think of it in these terms, but most people want to think that everything they believe is a law. Mm-hmm. That everything they believe is a truth that is not only true today, but it's going to be true next year and the year after. And I just think the number of things that are laws in investing or anything like that are very few. There's a great book that I like by a guy named Sam Arbsman called The Half-Life of Facts. And the title of the book explains everything you need to know. Almost every fact in most fields over time has a half-life, as in things that we thought were true, either as we learn more, it turns out it was not true, or just the world evolves to make something less true or not true anymore. And that's one of the books that really changed how I think about a lot of things in life. It had a big impact on me. And so I think that's how it depends on what field someone is in. But I think that general framework, that there's probably no more than a half dozen laws in your field. Yeah. And everything else above that, you need to be open to changing your mind about at some point. It doesn't mean that you're not going to firmly believe it today, but realize that it might not be that true later is so incredibly important. I'll give you an example from investing. and I'll try not to be too technical about this, but for most of the early 2000s, from 2000 to 2007, value investing, which is why you're buying cheap companies that trade at a low valuation, was very popular and it worked very well. If you were a value investor during that period, you made a lot of money. You beat the market, you did well. And then so value investing became popular. This is when, Warren Buffett has always been kind of a household name, but he became an icon to investors during this period because he's a value investor. Sales of Ben Graham's books and it just became like this cult of value investing during this period. And then since 2007, since interest rates have been declining during that period, since the great financial crisis, almost nothing has worked worse than value investing. It's been a terrible way to invest, not just for a short period of time, but for the past 13 years. And so this is an area where what's interesting about the period in the last 10 years is that so many people became so like a religious devotion to value investing. They considered value investing a law of investing, that they were unwilling to let go of it over the last 10 years. And look, you can make the argument that you shouldn't let go of it. Value investing will come back. You can make all these other arguments. This is not black and white, but I think it has shocked a lot of people in the last 13 years that what they considered to be a permanent truth of investing has turned out to be maybe, not necessarily not true, but much different than they once assumed. So that's an example of investing. You can learn about something about how the world works, but you need to be ready to maybe not let go of it, but soften your grip on it at some point in the future. Like everything's always changing. The whole purpose of history is basically to study the moments of change throughout time. Like that's all history is things changing and things happening that people did not expect. So we can't use history as a guide to the future because history, almost by definition, is the study of change throughout time. So it's always going to be different, and there's always going to be things that we thought were inevitable that turn out not to be over time.
Do you have a few laws for how to live an optimal life, an enjoyable life, like some maxims that, not just investment wise, I've read some of the laws you've written about when it comes to finance and investing. We can talk about those in a second, but I'm curious just from like a way of being, a way of treating others, a way of being, of just living your life. Do you have laws in that regard?
I don't know if I have that many specifically that I can think of. Maybe be nice to your wife, eat your fruits and vegetables, and get some exercise. That's most of what I can come up with. Live below your means, save some money. That's about it. In finance in particular, the laws that I would come up with, I mean, I've written about something more specific than this, but I would say living below your means, investing with a long-term philosophy, and accepting and expecting volatility. That's 90% of finance. That's 90% of it. You don't need to, that's it. Those are the things that I think will always be true. It's hard to imagine a world in which those things are not true, and they're powerful. Those are the things that move the needle. Whether you are whether you're 17 years old or a billionaire professional investor, those are the things that actually matter and move the needle in terms of people's results.
Do you play a role in who Collaborative Fund hires or who they choose to bring on the team? Do you have any involvement in that?
Yeah, our team is still fairly small, but we did some hiring. I think it was probably 2 years ago now, where we brought some more people on. And yeah, I was involved in that. And it was fascinating.
What do you other than expertise in a specific field for the job that they are hired to do? Those are the table stakes. You have to have those. Other than those, what do you look for in a person to bring to work at your company?
What's interesting is when we were hiring, I think all of us who are, part of the hiring process, we're looking for different things. Mm-hmm. To me, I'm always looking for people who, I guess you could summarize it as authenticity, because if you've ever been in part of a job interview where you're interviewing someone else, you can smell most people's BS so easily. Mm-hmm. And I love when people are just more open about, when they're describing their strengths. If you describe it in perfect terms, I'm so good at this, and I'm so good at this. Well, you're probably not. No one is that good at anything. Mm-hmm. And if you're not actively bringing up some of your weaknesses and just being a real person, I always look, this is something I did at the Motley Fool in the few interviews that I did that I thought was really helpful for me is when it became my turn to interview someone, I would say, hey, do you want to go for a walk around the neighborhood? Let's go for a walk around the block. Let's not sit here in this interrogation, table where it's like an FBI agent, and you're like under indictment and it's like a deposition. That doesn't bring out anyone's real side. Let's go for a walk around the block. And this is your job interview. I want to make that clear. But let's just go for a walk and chat. And I feel like at that moment, you can almost like feel the tension leaving the room. And then you see the real person. Like the previous round of interview that they did during the deposition across the table was an act. It's an act for everyone. I don't blame people for that, but it's all an act. And as soon as you go for a walk with them out, around the block, you're getting such a clear view of who that person actually is. They become so much more authentic because walking around the block with someone and having a walk and chat is more attuned to what people normally do when they're just walking with their friends, talking about life. So I really like that. I thought that was just a way to bring out authenticity, which is what I want to see, because a lot of people will put on the act during their job interview. I don't blame them for that. It's a natural thing to do, to put your best foot forward. But then they join a company and the people who hired you and you yourself, the person who's joining the company, realize that like maybe this isn't a good fit because it seemed like a good fit when I was putting on an act, but now that the act is over, maybe it's not. So that's always what I'm looking for.
So you've written about permanent assumptions, which we briefly touched on some of those, and talked a little bit about history. One of the permanent assumptions that I want to bring up and discuss, because you do this really well, and I think leaders in general need to develop this skill, and that is storytelling. Stories, I quote you, stories are more powerful than statistics, and most statistics are incomplete props to justify a story. Stories are easier to remember, easier to relate to, and emotionally persuasive. Can you talk to me about your framework behind the use of stories, the power of stories, and then a little bit of how to get better at telling stories?
I think a lot of it, there's a frustration in a lot of fields where people with the best answer, the right answer, the most complete answer, don't always get the prize. The prize usually goes to the person who can explain something well, even if what they're explaining is a subpar answer. And that frustrates a lot of people, particularly in fields like engineering and whatnot, where people who are not as good at their job get a promotion. And it's not, and a lot of it's because the people who got promoted were just better at they're better at storytelling. And stories are what actually moves the needle in life. It's not necessarily data. It's whether you can convince someone that something is true. And you convince people that something is true through stories, because once you tell someone a story and you personify a problem, you put it in human terms, you tell the emotion about why something's going to happen, it's so much easier for the person on the other end who is listening to contextualize how it's going to apply to them. If you just show someone data and it's just a bunch of numbers, it's hard to, even if the numbers are, these are your odds of dying in a car accident. In theory, you should be able to apply those to yourself and say, how do these odds apply to me? But if you tell a personal story about someone dying in a car accident and the tragedy that it did to their family, et cetera, then you're going to, that story is not going to leave your head for the rest of the day, the rest of the week. You're going to be thinking about it. It's going to stick with you. If you can contextualize how it's going to impact you personally. I think that's what stories do. It's also just a lot more for a writer. There's so much content online that readers have very low patience. If you start reading an article, if you're not hooked within 3 seconds, the reader's gone. They're out of there. They moved on to something else. There's a billion other blog posts to read. They're gone. So you have to just be able to, how do you quickly be able to capture someone's attention and quickly be able to say, oh, this is something that I'm going to be interested in, that's going to tell a story, that's going to, give me an insight into how the world works and other people's weaknesses, how other people succeeded in a way that I might be able to apply to myself. It's a more persuasive way of writing than just putting out cold facts. And that's not always intuitive, because you want to think that the world is governed by cold facts, things that are just obviously true. And it's not how it works. And this explains why a lot of the inefficiencies of life explain that, why people, why companies with subpar products succeed and companies with great products sometimes fail, it's because it's not, cold facts don't move the needle. Stories do, storytellers do. And you see that in a lot of companies, whether it's most people, the companies that they work at, the people who get the promotion are not always the people who do the best work. It's the people who are able to explain how things work and are kind of the schmoozers. Like schmoozing is a form of storytelling. It's getting yourself out there. Yeah.
How have you developed a skill to get better at this?
It's always just a lot of reading. There's no good writer out there who is not an obsessive reader and who reads, 5 times more than they write, or 100 times more than they write. That's all it is. That's all it is. It's just because the reading is how you find the stories. It's how you find the examples of what you're going to write about. But it's also just a window into what is good storytelling. Oh, I read this book and it was so good. Or I read this book and it just lost me. I didn't get it. That's just good feedback for what makes a good story, which is it's a topic that is really nuanced and hard to define, to describe. Like, what makes a good story? It's hard to define. There's no formula for that. So I think the only way you can do it is just through lots of reading, where you're just gaining more feedback, more information on, oh, this was good, this wasn't. What was good about this? What was bad about this? I don't know. But if I've read 500 of these, I'm getting a clearer sense of like how I want to be a storyteller myself.
Yeah. Morgan, do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
So 5 lessons from history. You've written about this. Lesson number 4. And this relates a little bit to the ability to stick with something that you answered in regards to excellence, that progress happens too slowly for people to notice. Setbacks happen too fast for people to ignore. I help people start podcasts and write books now and do other things. And I found that most people quit. They quit pretty early because it gets hard, because not enough people are paying attention to their podcast, or writing a book's really hard. And so they start and they're all excited and then they quit. And this felt in line with what you're writing about as a lesson from history. One of the examples you use the Wright brothers, so you can share about them or anything else, but really the thought behind progress happens too slowly for people to notice. Setbacks happen too fast for people to ignore.
Yeah, I mean, there are no overnight miracles. Like maybe 2020, there's a vaccine overnight, but like in general, there are no overnight miracles. But there are lots of overnight tragedies. September 11th, the bomb in Beirut this week. There are tragedies that happen not only overnight but instantly. In a blink of an eye, you can have a tragedy. Whereas progress usually often takes decades to slowly compound into something great. And look, that's what makes it so hard. If you look at any kind of path of human progress, it's hard not to be an optimist about the increase in living standards, the decline in poverty, the increase in technology, increased stock market returns, whatever it is. You should be an optimist. But at every single point throughout human history, if you open up the daily news, it's filled with reasons to be pessimistic. And I think just understanding why that is, that there's so much constant pessimism that we see even throughout this arc of so much progress. That's the explanation. It's that the decline, the bad parts happen very quickly. So they're always catching our attention. They're in the news headlines. They're here. You're paying attention to them. You can't miss them. Your friends are talking about them. The progress happens so slowly that you can't. It's just. I mean, think about something like with medical technology. If you compare medicine today, Western medicine today, with where it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago, not that long ago, we've made so much incredible progress during that period. But the news headlines that progress made during the were few and far between, because it's a slow progress every year. That's just how compounding works. If you're getting 3 or 4% better at every year in one given year, in any given year, even in any given 5 years, it doesn't look like that much. But if you look at after 30 years, you're in a different universe from where you started. So I think that's really the thrust behind it, is how counterintuitive compounding is. That's what makes progress happen so slowly. Even though progress is more powerful than the setbacks that we've had throughout human history, the positive outweighs the negative by 1 billion to 1. But it's hard to see that, because that compounding that gets us there takes decades and takes lifetimes to achieve.
Yeah, love it. Morgan, thank you so much for investing your time with me here today. You have that choice, obviously. I'm very appreciative. Where would you send my viewers and listeners to learn more about you online?
So most of what I do is on Twitter. My handle is Morgan Housel, first name, last name. Also, my book's coming out September 8th, The Psychology of Money.
The Psychology of Money, Timeless Lessons on Wealth, Greed, and Happiness. I can guarantee it's worth your time to get it. I read everything that you put out online, so obviously I'm going to buy the stuff that you put out in book form. Congratulations on getting that one out, and I would love to continue our dialogue as we both progress, man.
Likewise, this has been fun. Thanks for having me today.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Morgan.
Great. Thanks.
All right.
Thank you. Appreciate it. All right. Take care.